The auctioneer's voice cut through the raw March wind, a rhythmic, hypnotic chant that felt like a funeral dirge. For Sarah Miller, it was. Each number he called, each slap of the gavel, was another shovelful of dirt on the life she'd built with Frank. She stood beside the old milk house, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching the pieces of her husband's dream being sold off to the highest bidder. The crowd was mostly men, neighbors and farmers from 3 counties over, their faces grim under seed corn caps. They kicked the tires of the equipment, their expressions a mixture of pity for her and the cold calculation of opportunity. The centerpiece of the sale, the crown jewel of Frank's ambition, was a 2-year-old International Harvester, 1066 tractor. It was a monster of a machine, gleaming red under the weak sun, its black and white cab a fortress of modern farming. It still had the new tractor smell of vinyl and clean hydraulic fluid. Frank had been so proud of it. "This is the future, Sarah," he'd said, his voice echoing in her memory. "No more freezing in the spring or baking in the summer. We're going to farm in comfort." Comfort had come at a price. Mr. Henderson from the bank stood near the auctioneer, his city suit looking out of place against the backdrop of muddy barn boots and faded denim. He held a clipboard, and every time the bidding climbed, he'd make a small, neat tick mark. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a man of ledgers and interest rates, and the ledger said Frank Miller owed the Farmers' Trust and Savings $52,416. The 1066 was the collateral. So was the 6-bottom plough, the new model Gleaner Combine, and the 24-foot disc that sat behind it. Across the way, leaning against the fender of his shiny new Ford F-250, was Earl Thompson. His farm bordered theirs to the west. Earl had been one of the first in the county to go all in on the new way of farming. He'd torn out the fence rows, mortgaged his granddaddy's land to the hilt, and bought the biggest John Deere money could buy. He watched the auction with a look that wasn't quite a smirk, but it was close. He saw this not as a tragedy, but as a validation of his own risk-taking. Frank had tried to keep up, and this was the result. The bidding on the 1066 stalled at $21,000. The auctioneer worked the crowd, his voice rising in manufactured excitement. $21,000. I got 21. Who'll give me 21.5? A beautiful machine, fellas. Barely broke in. You won't find another one this clean till next year's models roll out. No one moved. Henderson gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the auctioneer. The gavel fell with a crack that made Sarah flinch. The big red tractor was gone. Next went the plough, then the disc. The combine brought in another 16,000. As the numbers added up on Henderson's clipboard, the pit in Sarah's stomach only grew deeper. She knew, and he knew, it wasn't going to be enough. After the big-ticket items were gone, the auctioneer moved to the smaller pieces, the odds and ends Frank had accumulated over 20 years. A hay rake, an old grain auger, a set of cultivators. Then his eyes landed on the machine parked at the back of the row, half hidden by the shadow of the corn crib. It was a Farmall M. Frank's father had bought it new in 1949. It was a relic, a piece of history. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, streaked with rust where the fenders had been welded and re-welded. The narrow front end, the simple steel pan seat, the upright steering wheel. It was from another era. Frank had learned to drive on that tractor. He'd used it to farm this very land for 15 years before the lure of horsepower and credit had taken hold. He kept it for odd jobs, running the auger or pulling a hay wagon. It was part of the farm, as much as the barn or the oak tree in the yard. "All right, folks, what am I bid for the old Farmall?" the auctioneer called out, his tone shifting. This wasn't a prize. This was clean-up. Runs good, I'm told. A classic. Who'll start me at $500? A few men chuckled. 500 was steep. You could pick one up for $350 if you looked around. Before anyone could make a bid, Sarah moved. She walked out from the shadow of the milk house, her boots making soft sounds in the gravel. She stopped in front of the old tractor and turned to face the auctioneer. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried on the wind. "That one's not for sale." The crowd went silent. All eyes turned to her. The auctioneer paused, confused. "Ma'am? That tractor is not part of the sale," she repeated, her chin held high. Mr. Henderson walked over, his face a mask of polite concern. "Mrs. Miller, Sarah, every little bit helps. We need to clear as much of the debt as we can." "It was my husband's first tractor. It stays," she said. It wasn't a request. Earl Thompson pushed himself off his truck, a look of disbelief on his face. He said, loud enough for half the crowd to hear, "What in God's name is she going to do with that old thing? Can't pull more than 2 bottoms?" Sarah ignored him. She looked directly at Henderson. "The bank can have the money from everything else. You can have a lien on the crops. But the land and that tractor are mine. That was the deal we made." Henderson sighed, looking down at his clipboard, then back at her resolute face. He knew when he was beaten. Frank's life insurance had paid off the land mortgage, a small mercy. The equipment loan was separate. Technically, the Farmall wasn't listed as collateral. It was too old, its value negligible on paper. He gave another small nod to the auctioneer. "Withdraw the Farmall." The auctioneer, eager to move on, quickly sold off the last few items. The crowd dispersed, trucks rumbling to life, checks being written. Soon the yard was empty, except for Sarah, Mr. Henderson, and the ghosts of Frank's ambition. The sale brought in $43,800, Henderson said, avoiding her eyes. "After the auctioneer's commission, you're still looking at a balance of just over $10,000, Sarah. The operating note for this year's seed and fertilizer will be on top of that. $10,000. It might as well have been $1 million. "I'll pay it," she said quietly. Henderson looked at her, then at the ancient Farmall M. He looked at the 80 acres of black dirt that stretched out behind the barn, waiting for the plough. He saw a woman in over her head, armed with a 30-year-old tractor, against a world that demanded more, bigger, faster. "How?" he asked, the single word hanging in the cold air. Sarah didn't answer right away. She walked over to the old Farmall and laid a hand on its rusty fender. The metal was cold and solid. It had no cab, no radio, no hydraulics to speak of beyond a simple lift. It ran on gasoline, not diesel. It was slow, inefficient, and obsolete. But it was paid for. It was hers. "I'll find a way," she said, more to herself than to him. As Henderson's car disappeared down the long gravel drive, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Sarah stood alone with the old tractor. The silence of the farm settled around her, a heavy blanket of responsibility. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows. It was March of 1973. Planting season was 6 weeks away. She had 80 acres to plough, disc, and plant. She had a $10,000 debt that was growing with interest every single day, and all she had to fight with was a stubborn heart and an old iron horse named Farmall. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what she did next, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever been in a spot like that? Backed into a corner, with everyone telling you you're beat, and all you've got left is one old, reliable tool that the rest of the world has written off as junk? Maybe it was an old truck, a set of hand-me-down wrenches, or just a piece of advice from your granddad. Let me know in the comments below, because what Sarah Miller decided to do in that barn with nothing but the smell of old grease and cold iron for company, took a kind of courage that's hard to find these days. The first step was seeing if the old girl would even run. Frank hadn't started it since last fall, when he'd used it to auger the last of the corn into the bin. She climbed onto the steel seat, the cold seeping right through her jeans. The layout was simple, a far cry from the bewildering array of levers and gauges in the 1066. A throttle lever on the steering column, a choke knob, an ignition switch, and a starter button on the dash. She pulled the choke out, turned the key, and pressed the button. The starter groaned, a low, tired sound. The engine turned over once, twice, then gave a weak cough. She tried again. The same thing. The battery was weak. Of course it was. She climbed down, her hopes already sinking. This was the first test, and she was already failing. She remembered Frank keeping a battery charger in the workshop. She found it on a dusty shelf, a heavy steel box with 2 thick cables. She hauled it out, clamped the leads onto the battery terminals, red to positive, black to negative, just like he'd taught her, and plugged it in. The charger hummed to life, its needle jumping over to the high end of the gauge. It would take a few hours. While it charged, she did what she could. She unscrewed the cap on the fuel tank and peered inside with a flashlight. It was half full, but the gasoline smelled stale, varnishy. That was a problem. Old gas could clog the carburetor. She found the sediment bowl, a small glass cup under the gas tank. It was full of murky, orange-tinted fuel and a layer of what looked like rust flakes. She carefully unscrewed it, the old gas spilling over her numb fingers, the smell sharp and acrid. She cleaned the bowl and the fine mesh screen inside with a rag, then screwed it back on. Next, she checked the oil. The dipstick came out showing oil that was thick and black as tar. It was long overdue for a change. She found the big drain plug under the engine block, slid a 5-gallon bucket underneath, and put a wrench on it. The plug was frozen solid. She put all her weight into it, her knuckles scraping against the cast-iron oil pan. It wouldn't budge. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. It was one thing to be determined. It was another to be beaten by a simple bolt. She stopped, took a deep breath of the cold, damp air, and thought. Frank always said, "Don't fight the iron, Sarah. Outsmart it." He had a 3-foot-long piece of steel pipe he called his persuader. She found it leaning in a corner. She slipped the pipe over the handle of the wrench, giving her another 2 feet of leverage. She positioned her feet, took a firm grip, and pulled steadily. There was a loud, sharp crack, like a gunshot in the quiet barn. For a terrifying second, she thought she'd broken something. But then the plug began to turn, groaning in protest. Thick, black oil, slow as molasses in the cold, began to drip, then pour into the bucket. By the time the sun had set, she had drained the old oil, replaced the filter, and poured in 5 fresh quarts of 30 weight. The battery charger's needle had dropped back toward 0. It was time. She climbed back onto the seat. This time, when she hit the starter, the engine spun with life. It turned over, coughed, and then, with a belch of blue smoke from the exhaust pipe, it roared to life. The sound wasn't the smooth, deep rumble of the 1066. It was a rough, clattering, uneven racket. But it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The whole tractor vibrated, the sheet metal rattling, the bare engine block shaking. She eased the throttle lever down, and the engine settled into a steady, rhythmic pop, 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 pop that echoed off the barn walls. It was running. The next morning, the reality of her situation came into sharp focus. Earl Thompson was already in his field across the road, his brand-new John Deere 40430, pulling a massive 24-foot field cultivator. The diesel engine hummed with power, and the enclosed cab protected him from the dust and the lingering chill. He was turning the black soil over with incredible speed, preparing his seedbed in long, perfect passes. Sarah hitched the Farmall M to Frank's old 14-foot disc. It was the biggest implement the M could reasonably handle. The tractor strained under the load. She had to keep it in second gear, crawling at a snail's pace. There was no cab, no protection from the elements. The wind whipped her hair and chapped her face. Dust kicked up by the disc coated her clothes, her skin, her teeth. The roar of the old engine was deafening. The steel seat, with its single coil spring, transferred every bump and jolt directly to her spine. By noon, she had managed to disc about 10 acres. Her arms ached from wrestling the manual steering, her back was screaming, and her ears were ringing. She looked across the road. Earl had already finished his entire 80-acre field and was heading home for lunch. He slowed his tractor as he passed her gate, looking over at her little patch of worked ground. He didn't wave. He just shook his head slowly and drove on. The gesture was clear. You're a fool. You can't win this way. The scorn of the community was a quiet but constant pressure. When she went to the co-op to arrange for her seed and fertilizer, putting it on the operating note Mr. Henderson had approved, the men sitting on the feed sack stopped talking when she walked in. They watched her with pitying eyes. Old man Hemmings, who'd known her father, took her aside. "Sarah, honey," he said, his voice gentle. "There's no shame in letting go. Frank was a good man, but he got in a little deep. Earl Thompson's offered to cash rent your ground. It's a fair price. You could pay off the bank and have a little left over. No one would think less of you." "I'm not letting go, Mr. Hemmings," she said, signing the paperwork for 2 tons of anhydrous ammonia. "This is my farm." Fixing the anhydrous applicator was another trial by fire. It was a newer piece of equipment, designed for a tractor with modern hydraulics. The Farmall M had a primitive hydraulic system called a lift-all that was designed for simpler tasks. To make it work, she had to spend a whole day in the workshop, cobbling together a mess of hoses, adapters, and valves she'd salvaged from the junk pile. She got covered in hydraulic fluid, a greasy film that soap and water wouldn't touch. But in the end, it worked. Barely. Planting was even slower than dissing. The old 4-row John Deere planter was all the Farmall could manage. She'd fill the seed boxes with corn, a slow, back-breaking process of hauling 80-pound bags up the planter steps. Then she'd crawl along, watching the markers, trying to keep her rows straight, while the whole county buzzed past her with their 6- and 8-row setups. Every day was a battle against time, against the weather, against her own aching body. One afternoon, in the far corner of the back 40, the tractor sputtered and died. She was out of gas. She hadn't checked the tank that morning, a rookie mistake born of exhaustion. It was a 2-mile walk back to the house. As she trudged along the fence row, covered in dirt and sweat, Earl Thompson's pickup truck pulled up on the road. He rolled down the window. "Looks like you've got trouble." "Ran out of gas," she said, not breaking her stride. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride to your fuel barrel." She hesitated. Accepting his help felt like admitting defeat, but her feet were already blistering, and the sun was hot. She climbed into the passenger seat. The cab was clean, cool, and quiet. The radio was playing softly. It was a different world. "You know, Sarah," he said, his eyes on the road, "this is no life for you. A woman alone, trying to run a farm with that museum piece. It's not right. It's my life, Earl. It doesn't have to be. My offer still stands. I'll rent the ground, and I'll even buy that old tractor off you for scrap value. Give you a clean break." "No, thank you," she said, her voice tight. He sighed, a sound of exasperation. "You're stubborn, just like Frank was. Look where it got him." The words hit her like a slap. She didn't respond. When they reached her farmstead, she got out, filled a 5-gallon can, and said, "Thank you for the ride." "You're just delaying the inevitable, Sarah," he called after her. She didn't look back. The long walk back to the tractor, carrying the heavy can of gasoline, felt like a penance. But as she poured the fuel into the tank, a new, harder resolve settled in her heart. She wasn't just farming to pay a debt anymore. She was farming to prove him, and everyone else, wrong. The spring of 1973 turned into summer. The corn grew tall, a testament to her relentless work. The first-year crop wasn't a record-breaker, but it was respectable. When she sold it that fall, the price of corn was on the rise. After paying for her seed, fuel, and fertilizer, she took every remaining dollar to the bank. She walked up to Mr. Henderson's desk and handed him a check for $4,500. He looked at the check, then at her. "This is impressive, Sarah. This is the entire profit." "I know," she said. "Put it against the principal. You're not keeping anything for living expenses? For repairs for next year?" "I'll manage," she said. "What's the balance now?" He did the math on his adding machine, the clacking of the keys filling the quiet bank lobby. "With interest, the remaining balance is $6,120. Her heart sank a little. She'd worked herself to the bone for an entire year, and she'd only knocked off about $4,000. The finish line still seemed impossibly far away. But the world was changing. In the fall of '73, the oil embargo hit. Fuel prices doubled overnight. The following year, inflation started to take off like a rocket. For most people, it was a disaster. But for farmers, it created a strange, intoxicating boom. The price of grain, driven by huge overseas sales to the Soviet Union and a weak dollar, went through the roof. Corn that had been $2 a bushel was suddenly selling for $3, then $3.50. Soybeans shot up to $7, $8, even $10. Suddenly, farmers were flush with cash, or more accurately, they were flush with equity. Land values exploded. A farm that was worth $500 an acre in 1972 was worth $1,500 an acre by 1975. The banks, eager to lend against this new, inflated collateral, opened the spigots. The message from the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was clear. Get big or get out. Plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Earl Thompson took the message to heart. He used his booming profits and skyrocketing land value to borrow more money than ever before. He bought another 160 acres that came up for sale down the road. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere Wolfriede 430 for a brand new Ferrari 630, and then a year later for an ATI 30, a massive 4-wheel drive articulated tractor that looked like a locomotive. He built huge grain bins and a new machine shed that dwarfed his house. He was the king of the county, the embodiment of the new agricultural prosperity. He and his wife took a vacation to Hawaii. Sarah watched it all from her side of the road. Her life didn't change. She kept the Farmall M. She patched its tires, welded its cracks, and kept its engine tuned. The high grain prices were a blessing, to be sure. In 1974, she made a bigger payment. In 1975, bigger still. She lived frugally, mending her own clothes, canning vegetables from a huge garden, and heating her small house with a wood stove. She bought nothing she couldn't pay for with cash. While her neighbors were buying new pickups and snowmobiles, Sarah was buying a new set of points and a condenser for the Farmall's magneto. The men at the co-op stopped looking at her with pity and started looking at her with a kind of confused disdain. She was a fool. She was sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. With her land now valued at over $2,000 an acre, she could borrow $100,000 without batting an eye. She could buy a new tractor, a new combine, rent more ground, and really start making money. "Sarah, you're missing the boat," Old Man Hemmings told her one day. "This is the time to expand. You're being too timid." "I'm just trying to get my head above water, Mr. Hemmings," she'd reply. "One step at a time." By the fall of 1977, 5 seasons after the auction, she walked into the bank for the 5th time. The corn crop that year had been good, and the price was still strong. She'd sold every last bushel. She had a certified check in her purse. Mr. Henderson greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His desk was piled high with loan applications from farmers wanting to expand even more. "Sarah, good to see you. Another good year, I trust." "It was," she said, pulling out the check and sliding it across the desk. He looked at it. The amount was for $1,254.13. "Is this the payment?" "That's the payoff," she said. "That should be the last of it." He stared at the check, then fumbled through his files to find her folder. He ran the numbers on his calculator, his brow furrowed. The clacking stopped. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Well, I'll be," he whispered. "You did it." A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over Sarah. 5 years. 5 years of sweat and grease and dust. 5 years of being laughed at, pitied and dismissed. She had done it. She owned her farm, free and clear. The only debt to her name was the $30 she owed on her electric bill. As Henderson stamped her paperwork, paid in full, the front door of the bank opened. In walked Earl Thompson, smiling, confident. He clapped Henderson on the back. "Henderson, my boy, I need to talk to you about financing a new center pivot irrigation system for that quarter I just picked up north of town. Interest rates are climbing, but a man's got to keep growing, right?" He noticed Sarah standing there, holding her stamped receipt. "Well, hello, Sarah. You making a deposit?" he asked, a condescending warmth in his voice. "Something like that," she said quietly. Henderson, looking from Earl's new loan application to Sarah's paid-off note, had a strange, troubled look on his face. "Congratulations, Sarah," he said, his voice sincere. "You keep farming with that relic?" Earl asked, shaking his head with a chuckle. "You could have been so much further ahead by now." Sarah just looked at him, then at her receipt. She didn't feel behind. For the first time in 5 years, she felt safe. She folded the paper, put it in her pocket, and walked out of the bank into the crisp autumn air. A free woman. But as she drove home in her old, paid-for pickup truck, the radio news was on. A man with a deep voice was talking about the Federal Reserve. He was talking about something called the prime interest rate, and how it had just been raised another full point to fight inflation. He said some economists were worried about what these high rates would do to people with large variable rate loans. Sarah didn't know much about economics, but a cold knot of dread began to form in the pit of her stomach. The boom times felt good, but she knew from a lifetime on the farm that nothing, not even a long, hot summer, lasts forever. Eventually, the weather always turns. The years that followed were a fragile piece. Sarah worked the land with a rhythm born of necessity and repetition. The Farmall M was no longer just a machine, it was an extension of her own will. She knew its every groan, its every shudder. She could diagnose a misfire by the change in the exhaust's rhythm, could feel a slipping clutch in the small of her back. She learned to do her own tune-ups, setting the points with a matchbook cover for a feeler gauge, cleaning the spark plugs with a wire brush and gasoline. Her operating costs were laughably low: fuel, oil, and the occasional part she could find at a salvage yard or order from a thin catalogue. She paid her property taxes, bought her groceries, and put every spare dollar into a savings account at the bank, an act that felt like building a stone wall against a coming flood. All around her, the boom roared on. The price of land crested at $2,000, then $2,500 an acre. Earl Thompson bought a brand-new four-wheel drive Steiger, a lime-green monster that could pull a 50-foot cultivator. He tore out the last of the woods on his property to gain another 15 acres of tillable ground. He talked of yields and futures markets and tax depreciation, a language Sarah barely understood. The logic of the era was inescapable. Borrow more to plant, more to make more. To stand still was to fall behind. Yet Sarah stood still, a small, stubborn island in a sea of frantic expansion. The first sign of trouble was the sky. The summer of 1979 came in hot and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy white sky. The corn, which had stood so proud and green in June, began to suffer. By mid-July, the leaves were curling inward during the heat of the day, a plant's desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The tassels emerged weak and shed their pollen onto silks that were dry and unreceptive. Sarah watched her fields with a familiar ache of powerlessness, the same feeling she'd had at Frank's auction. There were things a farmer simply could not control. Across the road, Earl's fields looked just as bad, if not worse. His new center pivot irrigation system, the one he'd gone into debt for, was useless. The county board had banned all major irrigation to conserve the rapidly dropping water table. His massive investment sat idle in the parched fields, a monument to misplaced faith in technology. The harvest that fall was a disaster. Yields were cut by more than half. The corn that did grow had small, light kernels. It was barely enough to cover the cost of planting. Then, in the winter, the other shoe dropped. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The news spread through the farming community like a disease. The vast, lucrative market they had all come to depend on vanished overnight. Sarah heard the news at the co-op. The big chalkboard that listed the daily cash prices for grain told the story. Corn, which had been trading near $3, had plummeted to $2.20. Soybeans had fallen by more than $2 a bushel. The men gathered around the board were silent, their faces grim. Earl Thompson was there, leaning against a pallet of seed bags. His usual bravado was gone. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The final blow came not from the sky or from Washington, but from within the machines themselves. One crisp October afternoon, as Earl was trying to salvage what was left of his soybean crop, his 2-year-old John Deere 8630 tractor broke down. Sarah saw it from her own field, where she was slowly dissing corn stalks with the old Farmall. The huge green tractor simply stopped, a plume of thick white smoke pouring from its exhaust stack. A dealer's service truck, with its crane and welders, arrived a few hours later. It sat in Earl's field for 2 days. The gossip at the diner was that he'd thrown a rod right through the side of the engine block. The repair bill, someone whispered, was over $15,000. It was more than the entire remaining debt Sarah had paid off 3 years prior. $15,000 for a single repair, at a time when cash was non-existent and the bank was no longer smiling. That same week, the water pump on the Farmall M began to leak. A steady drip, drip, drip of green antifreeze onto the front axle. Sarah drove it back to the shed, drained the radiator into a bucket, and took the pump off with a 1/2-inch wrench. She drove her pickup to the auto parts store in town, where the man behind the counter found a rebuild kit for it on a dusty back shelf. It cost $12.40. She spent the evening at the workbench in her barn, pressing out the old bearings and seals and carefully installing the new ones. By morning, the pump was back on the tractor, the radiator was refilled, and the engine was popping away as reliably as ever. The total cost of her breakdown was less than $13 and an evening of her own time. She looked across the road at the silent, wounded green machine in Earlsfield and felt not a shred of triumph, only a deep and chilling premonition. The turning point had passed. The fall was coming. The early 1980s descended upon the heartland like a plague. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate into the stratosphere. 18%, 20%, 21%. The variable rate loans that farmers like Earl Thompson had signed with such confidence in the good times now became instruments of torture. The monthly interest payments alone were more than most farms could gross in a year. Simultaneously, the foundation of their wealth crumbled beneath them. Land values, which had seemed to defy gravity, collapsed. The same acre that had been collateral for a $2,000 loan was now worth only $800. Men who had thought they were millionaires on paper woke up to find they were bankrupt. The bankers who had been so eager to lend now became grim reapers, their briefcases filled with foreclosure notices. Mr. Henderson, at the Farmers' Trust and Savings, aged 10 years in 2. The friendly greetings were gone, replaced by the strained, hollow look of a man forced to destroy the lives of his own neighbors. The signs were everywhere. Farm sales dotted the weekend papers, not for retirement, but for bankruptcy. The local John Deere dealer, a business that had been in the same family for 50 years, locked its doors for good. The high school graduating class shrank as entire families packed up and moved away, seeking work in cities they didn't know. A quiet desperation settled over the countryside. Sarah survived. With no debt, her world was insulated from the storm. Her needs were simple. The Farmall M sipped gasoline, not guzzled expensive diesel. Her property taxes were manageable. The small profits from her 80 acres were enough. She wasn't getting rich, but she wasn't going broke. She was a rock in a raging river, holding her ground while everything around her was washed away. One evening in the spring of '82, a knock came at her door. It was Earl Thompson. He looked thin, defeated. His expensive boots were scuffed, his jacket worn. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a stoop in his shoulders. "Sarah," he said, his voice raspy. He couldn't meet her eyes. "The bank. They're calling my notes, all of them. I need to come up with $20,000 in cash by the first of the month, or they're starting the proceedings." He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "I was wondering if you could see your way to co-signing a loan for me, just until the prices come back up. Your land is free and clear. The bank would do it with your signature." Sarah's heart ached for him, for his wife, for his children. She saw in his face the same terror she had felt the day the auctioneer came for Frank's equipment. But she also saw the abyss he was asking her to step into. Co-signing that loan would be tying her own farm, her own survival, to his sinking ship. It would be a betrayal of everything she had worked for, of Frank's memory, of the promise she had made to herself, standing by that rusty tractor. "Earl, I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I just can't." He stared at her for a long moment, the last flicker of hope dying in his eyes. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, turned, and walked back to his truck, a man walking toward his own execution. The auction was held on a cold, blustery day in November, almost 10 years after Frank's. The scene was sickeningly familiar, yet horribly different. The crowd was larger, harder-faced. There were more suits, more men with clipboards who weren't neighbors. The mood wasn't one of pity, it was the cold, calculating atmosphere of a feeding frenzy. Sarah stood at the back, near the same milk house where she had stood at her own sale. She watched as Earl's empire was dismantled, piece by expensive piece. The giant Steiger tractor, which he had paid over $100,000 for, sold for $30,000. The massive grain bins, fixtures on the landscape, were sold for scrap metal value to a crew who would come and tear them down. His new machine shed, his trucks, his tools, everything went for a fraction of its worth. The auctioneer moved to the household goods. Earl's wife, a proud woman who had once hosted the church ladies' society in her beautiful new home, stood weeping silently as strangers bid on her furniture, her dishes, her children's bicycles. Earl stood beside her, his face a stone mask, his arms wrapped around her. Sarah couldn't watch any more. She turned to leave, but her eye caught on a small item on one of the hay racks filled with miscellaneous tools. A heavy-duty bench vise, mounted on a thick wooden plank. She recognized it. She had seen it in Earl's workshop. It had belonged to his father. She saw the auctioneer's assistant place a sticker with the number 347 on it. She walked over to the clerk's trailer. When lot 347 came up, she raised her hand. There was another bid from a scrap dealer. Sarah raised again. The dealer shook his head and moved on. The gavel fell. She paid the clerk $17 and loaded the heavy vise into the back of her truck. It wasn't a trophy. It was an act of preservation, a small attempt to save one single piece from the wreckage. As she drove away, she saw the bank representative tacking a formal foreclosure sign to the front door of the house Earl had built. The day after the sale, Sarah saw a moving truck pull out of the Thompsons' long driveway for the last time. She didn't know where they were going. A few days later, she was out by her mailbox when a battered old car she didn't recognize pulled over. It was Earl. He got out and walked toward her. "Heard you bought my dad's old vise," he said, his voice flat. "I did," Sarah replied. "What for?" "I don't know. Just seemed wrong for it to go to the scrap man." They stood in silence for a moment, the November wind whistling through the bare branches of the trees. "We're staying with my wife's sister over in the next county," he said. "I've been looking for work. No one's hiring." He paused, swallowing his pride. It was a visible, painful effort. "Sarah, I know it's a hell of a thing to ask, but do you have any work? Anything at all? Fencing, cleaning out a shed. I'll do anything. I just need to earn something." This was the man who had mocked her, who had shaken his head at her foolishness, who had told her she was delaying the inevitable. And here he was, asking for a job. The temptation for a sharp, vindicating reply was immense. But looking at his brokenness, she felt no victory. She thought of the Farmall M, the symbol of her own struggle. It had taught her more than just mechanics. It had taught her humility and endurance. "The fence row on the back 40 needs clearing," she said, her voice even. "And the corn crib could use new siding before winter really sets in. I can pay you $4 an hour." Tears welled in Earl's eyes. He blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you, Sarah," he mumbled. "I'll start in the morning." The sight of Earl Thompson working on Sarah Miller's farm became the talk of the township. At first, he was sullen and silent, the shame of his situation a heavy cloak. She set him to the task of clearing the fence row, a brutal job of cutting brush and pulling old wire. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy. One afternoon, she brought him a thermos of coffee and a sandwich. They sat on the tailgate of her truck, not saying much. "This is hard work," he said, looking at his blistered hands. "It is," she agreed. The next week she needed to move some hay bales. The only machine for the job was the Farmall M. She showed him how to start it, how the hand clutch worked, how to ease it into gear. He climbed onto the steel-panned seat, his big frame looking out of place on the small tractor. As he drove it across the yard, the engine popping and clattering, she saw a change in his face. He was feeling every bump, breathing in the exhaust fumes, wrestling with the manual steering. For the first time, he was experiencing the reality she had lived for years. It was a more powerful lesson than any lecture could ever be. Earl worked for her through that winter and into the next spring. The hard physical labor seemed to burn away his bitterness, leaving behind a quiet humility. He was a good worker, and he knew things about farming Sarah didn't. He showed her how to better set her old planter for more accurate seed depth, and how to read the clouds for signs of changing weather. They became a team, an unlikely partnership born from ruin and resilience. The farm crisis eventually bottomed out. The banks, having foreclosed on so many, were now stuck with land they couldn't sell. In 1985, Mr. Henderson called Sarah. The bank was trying to clear its books. The 80-acre parcel that included Earl's house, barn, and sheds was for sale. They were practically giving it away. Sarah had been saving. For 8 years, she had lived on almost nothing, banking her profits. She went to the bank, sat down with Mr. Henderson, and with a single check written from her savings account, she bought the heart of Earl Thompson's old farm. She didn't tell Earl what she had done. She just kept him on, paying him a fair wage. He and his wife eventually moved into a small rental house in town. He saved his money as fiercely as she once had. 2 years later, on a warm summer evening, she invited Earl and his wife over for supper. After they had eaten, she laid a document on the kitchen table. It was a contract for deed, selling the 80 acres with the house and buildings back to him. The price was exactly what she had paid the bank for it, with no interest. The payments were structured to be small, something he could afford from the wages he earned working for her, and from the part-time job he'd picked up at the grain elevator. Earl stared at the paper, his hands trembling. His wife began to cry softly. "Why?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "After everything, why would you do this for me?" Sarah looked out of the kitchen window at the fields, dark under the rising moon. "Because this is your home, Earl," she said, "and because no one should have to go through losing it. I know what that feels like." In that moment, her victory was complete. It wasn't in owning his land or proving him wrong. It was in being able to offer a hand up to the very man who had once looked down on her. It was a vindication not of pride, but of character. Years melted into one another. The 1990s arrived, bringing better prices and stability. Sarah Miller never expanded. Her 80 acres were enough. She became a quiet legend in the county, the woman who had survived the great crash. Younger farmers, wary of the siren song of debt, would sometimes stop by, asking for her advice. She'd show them the Farmall M, which she still used for light chores. Her nephew, a young man with Frank's eyes and a love for the land, started spending his summers with her. She taught him how to farm, but more importantly, she taught him her philosophy. One afternoon, they were in the workshop, tuning the old tractor. The boy, accustomed to the sleek, computerized machines of his era, looked at the M's simple, greasy engine. "Aunt Sarah," he asked, "why did you keep this old thing all these years? You could have afforded a new one a long time ago." Sarah wiped her hands on a red rag, the smell of gasoline and old iron clinging to her. She put a hand on the tractor's faded fender, the metal warm from the sun. "Because this tractor taught me the most important lesson there is," she said, looking her nephew in the eye. "It's not about how much you can farm or how fast you can go. It's about what you own and what owns you." She looked past him, out the open barn door. Across the road, Earl Thompson, his hair now grey, was fixing the fence in front of the house he now owned again, free and clear. Her own fields were planted, the corn standing straight and green. A sense of profound peace settled over her. The auctioneer's chant was a distant echo, the sting of humiliation long gone. She had faced down debt, scorn, and despair. She had worked, she had endured, and she had prevailed, not by getting bigger, but by holding fast to what was real. And in the quiet hum of the land, in the steady pop, pop, pop of an old engine, she had found a legacy far richer than money could ever buy.